Hey church, today we are going to look at another one of Jesus's obscure parables. This one comes from the Gospel of Matthew chapter 13, and we're looking at just one verse, which is verse 33. The parable goes like this. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and hid and mixed into 60 pounds of flour until the whole batch of dough was permeated by it. Now, you may have heard this parable before, and you may have your own interpretations. As I've discovered in my research, there are a number of interpretations, and the two major ones of what this parable means actually are in complete disagreement with one another. So our job is to come to God's Word, wrestling, questioning, praying, and seeking what the correct way, what the best way to interpret this is. So I just want to sort of lay out the two major interpretations and then give us some wisdom on how we can navigate this tricky parable. The biggest discussion about this parable is this idea of this woman mixing in yeast or leaven into this batch of flour in order to make dough for whatever she's making. The reason why this is controversial is that throughout most of the Bible, in the Old Testament and the New Testament as well, the idea of yeast or leaven usually represents something quite negative or evil. In the Exodus event, as the people are leaving Egypt, they are told to prepare themselves flour, dough, without leaven in it. And the idea behind it is that they're doing this because they are in a hurry to get out. But then this sort of continued to permeate the idea of how Israel was supposed to look and act as a nation, that whenever they were to make recipes, they weren't supposed to add yeast. That in doing so, adding this foreign substance into something that was pure sort of represented this corruption of who they were as people. And so even to this day, Jewish people tend to, when they cook, don't add yeast or leaven to their bread. And so it makes these sort of more hard cracker type bread mixtures. Even Jesus uses this term when he says, "Beware of the yeast or the leaven of the Pharisees." Paul uses similar language, talking about how a little bit of yeast added into a batch of flour can corrupt something, and he's talking about the church's association with worldly practices, and he says those ought to be avoided. And so some people view this parable as that the dough is something that represents the church or the kingdom, and that the leaven or the yeast that gets added to it is this corrupting influence, and that if we let, as a church, if we let a little bit of corrupting influence into our midst, it will mix in and totally destroy the whole thing. This gets further evidence when we look at the previous parables that Jesus talks about. In the parable of the sower, Jesus talks about how the gospel, the kingdom is like seeds that have been scattered along different paths or different types of soil. And some of it gets grown up and choked out by weeds. Weeds grow amongst it. And another parable that comes right before this as well, he talks about the kingdom as being these plants that are planted, but among them an enemy comes in overnight, and he also plants weeds, and the weeds and the wheat grow up together, and they get tangled. And that as something good is growing, so something bad grows beside it. And so some people view this as a negative parable, that as the church, as the kingdom, we ought to beware of even the smallest of corrupting influences. And that's how people interpret it. The opposite way is also interesting, that people view this as that the dough actually represents sort of the world, and that The leaven, the yeast, actually is the kingdom. That as a little bit of the kingdom enters into the world, that kingdom, it changes what the world starts to look like. Just a little bit of influence of the gospel of Jesus can actually transform the whole landscape of the world around us. So which one of these two opposing definitions or understandings is it? Well, let me just break down a few of the components that we ought to examine. First of all, when we look at the idea of yeast or leaven, the point of it is that, yes, in the Bible it's often used as a negative thing, but not always. And more importantly, yeast or leaven, the most important part of what that means is simply that it is a permeative influence. That it is a catalyst of change. It transforms the structure of one thing into something different. So it doesn't, in this context, necessarily have a negative context, but a neutral one. That simply, the emphasis is on that whenever you add yeast to flour, it will change what is produced. That's the emphasis there. Secondly, the idea of flour here, notice it says in our NIV is that it was 60 pounds of flour. In Greek, it's the word 3 seahs, which is a common biblical amount of flour. We see the same amount of flour when Abraham and Sarah are visited by these angelic beings. They produce a meal, this feast, with this same amount of flour. In the same way, Gideon, he gets visited by an angel of the Lord, and it says that he prepares an offering using this same amount of flour. In Leviticus and in Exodus, it also talks about using this amount, bringing it to the temple as a grain offering. And a grain offering is simply an offering that says recognizing God's provision for your life and your thankfulness for him. And so this same amount of flour gets used throughout the Bible as sort of a symbol of sharing, of friendship, of thankfulness, of community. And so there's another aspect to focus on. And so what is this about? Is it about corrupting influence into the church, or is it about the church's influence on the corrupt world around it? Well, now that we know a little bit more of the details, here's where the emphasis lies. That no matter how you interpret this parable, the emphasis is that there's something hidden that starts small, but it has a powerful influence over everything else. I tend to interpret this as the second way, because it says the kingdom of heaven is like yeast. So immediately it says it's like yeast, that it permeates the rest of the batch. And so my personal opinion is that's how I understand it, that a little bit of God's kingdom in the rest of the world can actually have a dominating influence. And we see this throughout the history of Christianity, that the movement of Jesus goes from 12 followers to several hundred followers within the first few years, and then within the first century it goes from several hundred people to several thousand people, and then over the next 2,000 years is gone from several hundred people to over 2 billion people who claim to follow Jesus. And from my own experience, and I'm sure from yours, we have seen how when even a little bit of Jesus gets a hold of someone's life, or a culture, or a community, or a city, or even an entire country, that it can dramatically change the influence. But also, the inverse can also be true, right? That as we as Christians, little bit of sin, a little bit of evil into our midst, well, that can also radically change us. So, the kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman added to flour, and that permeated the entire batch.